Good evening. May I start by welcoming all those who are here with us at Beverly Hills Synagogue in person. Baruchim habaim. Thank you so much for joining us for this very special and very important event. I would also like to welcome all those who are joining us on the live stream, whether you're here in Los Angeles or elsewhere across the United States or somewhere else. Baruchim habaim to you too. We are very honored to be hosting this event at Beverly Hills Synagogue as part of the Communities in Conversation project to commemorate the first yahrtzeit, the first anniversary of the passing of Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, Harav Yaakov Tzvi ben David Aryeh, Zecher Tzadik Livracha. Rabbi Sacks was the chief rabbi of the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth between 1991 and 2013. But much more importantly, he was a teacher and a mentor to hundreds of thousands of people, Jews and non-Jews, who for many decades benefited and continue to benefit from his wisdom and from his unique ability to articulate that wisdom in the spoken and the written word. I think it's fair to say that in recent history, there has been no greater expositor of Jewish knowledge and Torah ideas to a wider, more diverse audience than Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. On a personal note, and those who've seen my tribute to him that I delivered in the days after his passing a year ago will know that my personal connection to Rabbi Sacks goes back to my earliest childhood. Let me just say this. Rabbi Sacks' loss hit me hard and has driven me to seek out his writings and online videos and to reread his books over this past year so that his influence doesn't wane or wither and that I can remain a mouthpiece for his incredible Torah teachings in whatever setting possible. I hope that I can live up to that aspiration even though he is no longer with us. Now, I could go on for a long time about Rabbi Sacks, but tonight is not actually a night for eulogies. Tonight is about learning Rabbi Sacks' Torah and studying that Torah together as a community. In fact, although it is tonight here in Beverly Hills, the Communities in Conversation program has been going on for a couple of days already. The yahrtzeit program began, listen to this, at 6 p.m. on Monday evening at the Carmel School in Perth, Australia. And just to put that into perspective for our live audience here, that was 3 in the morning on Monday for us. And the Communities in Conversation program is going to continue into tomorrow. Do you know why? So that it can accommodate the many places and the many thousands of people who want to share in this astonishing international day of learning based around the teachings of Rabbi Sacks. I believe that Rabbi Sacks is smiling down at us from heaven. He could not have wished for a better, more appropriate tribute. Thank you, Elaine. And thank you, Dina, Josh, and Gila, for facilitating this wonderful project. Thank you to Joanna Benarosh at the Rabbi Sacks Legacy Foundation, who has been the captain of the ship, instrumental in making sure all the details are in place and that everyone knows what to do and when to do it. Here in Beverly Hills, let me say thank you to Madeline and Carly. Yes, that's long-suffering Carly, you know her. And also to Daryl and to Gay and Sarah and to all our security staff. And of course, let me thank our sponsors, Stadium Capital of London, Anthony and Laurie Spencer, and Josh Fruman and Susan Grayson, and also to all the other supporters who have made tonight possible. But now, without further ado, let's get into the learning. Tonight, I have chosen for my topic a subject that is very close to my heart. And it was a subject that Rabbi Sacks spoke about a lot, although it doesn't really feature in his most regularly study Divrei Torah. The topic I've chosen tonight is Israel, the land of hope, in the words of Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. Let's begin by watching a short video, and let's see what Rabbi Sacks has to say.
The story of Israel is one without parallel in history. The story of the love of a people for a land, the love of Jews for Israel. There in ancient times, our people was born. And there in modern times, our people was reborn. The day will come when the story of Israel in modern times will speak not just to Jews, but to all who believe in the power of the human spirit as it reaches out to God, as an everlasting symbol of the victory of life over death, hope over despair. Because Israel has achieved great things. It's taken a barren land and made it bloom. It's taken an ancient language, the Hebrew of the Bible, and made it speak. It's taken the West's oldest faith and made it young. It's taken a tattered, shattered nation and made it live. Israel is the country whose national anthem, Hatikva, means hope. Israel is the home of hope. Yom Ha'atzmaut Sameach.
An amazing video, very evocative, incredibly powerful. In it, Rabbi Sacks began his short presentation by saying that the story of the land of Israel is one that has no parallel in history, that it is the story of the love of a people for a land, that it is the story of the love of Jews for Israel. Elsewhere, Rabbi Sacks wrote about this specific historical aspect of the Jewish connection to Israel in much greater detail. I would like to share his words with you tonight so that you can hear them yourself. No religion in history, said Rabbi Sacks, has been as closely tied to a land as Judaism has been with the land of Israel. The connection between the Jews and Israel goes back almost 4,000 years. From the very first words of God to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, Lech lecha me'artzecha u'mimoladetecha mi'beit avicha el haaretz asher areka. Leave your country, your birthplace, and your father's house, and go to the land that I will show you. And as soon as Abraham arrived in the land, God appeared to him. Vayera Hashem el Avram, vayomer, lezaracha eten et haaretz hazot. God said to Abraham, I will give this land to your offspring. All in all, God promised the land of Israel to Abraham no less than 7 times. And he also promised it to Isaac, Abraham's son, and to Jacob, Isaac's son. The word teshuvah, said Rabbi Sacks, is often translated as repentance. But if you translate the word teshuvah literally, it means homecoming. In a double sense, a spiritual homecoming to God and a physical homecoming to the land of Israel. Israel is the Jewish people's place of destiny. It is a tiny land for a tiny people, and yet the role of the land of Israel in our religious history has been vast. The land of Israel is the land to which Moses and the Israelites traveled across the desert for 40 years. The land of Israel is the land from which we were exiled, not once, but twice. The land of Israel is the land to which our ancestors journeyed whenever they could, and it is the land from which they never voluntarily left. The land of Israel is the land that the Jewish people has never relinquished. If Jewish history is anything, it is the story, the long roller coaster story of the Jewish people's longing for a land, And that land is the land of Israel. The land of Israel, said Rabbi Sacks, remains the place where Jews were summoned and where they are still summoned by God to create a society of justice and compassion under the sovereignty of God. And although later on in history the land of Israel was considered holy by Christians and by Muslims, the centers of these other faiths were always elsewhere. For Western Christians it was Rome, for Eastern Christians it was Constantinople, and for Muslims it was Mecca and Medina. As Rabbi Sacks noted, there are 56 Islamic states today, and there are 82 Christian ones. But there is only one Jewish state. Israel is the only place on earth where Jews are a majority. It is the only place on earth where Jews enjoy self-rule. And it is the only place on earth where Jews are able to build a society and to shape a culture as Jews. Rabbi Sacks continues, in 1917, the British government issued a document known as the Balfour Declaration. This document, which declared that the British government viewed with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, was subsequently ratified by the League of Nations. And that happened long before the Holocaust. The Balfour Declaration, said Rabbi Sacks, was an attempt to rectify the lingering denial of a nation's right to its land and to rectify the persecution of Jews in country after country, century after century, in a history of suffering that has no parallel in human history. The Jews who returned to the land of Israel were not strangers. They weren't outsiders. They weren't an imperial presence, and they were not a colonial force. The Jews who returned to the land of Israel may never have physically lived there, but they were the land's original inhabitants. You see, the Jewish people is the only people in 4,000 years who ever created an independent nation in the land of Israel, the only one. Every other occupier of the land of Israel, from the Assyrians and the Babylonians to the Greeks and the Romans, and more recently the Ottomans and the British, they were all imperial powers who ruled the land as a district of their vast realms. Most notable of all, says Rabbi Sacks, is the fact that the Egyptians never offered the Palestinian Arabs a state when they ruled Gaza between 1948 and 1967, and neither did the Jordanians offer the Palestinian Arabs a state when they ruled the West Bank during those very same years. Isn't it ironic, says Rabbi Sacks, that the only nation to have ever offered the Palestinian Arabs a state is the Jewish state of Israel? And every day in the land of Israel and across the Jewish world, we pray for peace. Everything that I have said until now consists of the words and thoughts of Rabbi Sacks. They are profound words, and they are profound thoughts. Not because they are innovative or unprecedented, but because of their clarity, and because, as one of the most respected and best known rabbinic leaders of the past generation, when he said these words and expressed these thoughts, they impacted in places that would never have considered them had they emanated from any other source. Now, in the notes that accompanied the sources for this topic that I'm talking about tonight, the Rabbi Sacks Legacy Foundation asked that we consider a number of questions after having heard Rabbi Sacks' own words. Among those questions were these: what impact has the story of the modern state of Israel had on you? Why is it so important for a faith nation to have a land? And what role does Israel play in your day-to-day life? I'll deal with these questions in order, but I urge you, all of you, to consider these questions on your own and to read up as much as you can in the published words of Rabbi Sacks, so that you can find a meaningful answer to these questions that works for you. The first question is this: what impact has the story of the modern state of Israel had on you? I'm going to come at this question from a totally different angle, because as far as I am concerned, it is only because of Israel's existence that Jews, obviously not all Jews, feel empowered to challenge the existence of the state of Israel. Let me explain what I mean. Throughout our history, as indicated by Rabbi Sacks, we have prayed daily for a return to Zion. We have yearned for an ingathering of exiles. We have supported the Jewish communities of the land of Israel, even as we waited for some sign that our prayers were being heard, that our wishes would come to fruition, and that the Jewish communities in the land of Israel would herald the beginning of the messianic redemption promised by the prophets of the Hebrew Scriptures. And when it didn't happen, we handed over the baton to the next generation in the hope that it would be their link in the generational chain that would witness the miraculous moment when a people without a land would be reunited with the land without a people. And then it happened. Not overnight, of course. It began with small groups of immigrants from Lithuania and Ukraine, Hasidim of the Baal Shem Tov and Talmidim of the Vilna Gaon at the end of the 18th century and at the beginning of the 19th century. Time after time, tragedy struck. There were natural disasters, there were pogroms, poverty was rampant. But the Jews, they just kept on coming. Smaller groups grew into larger groups. Sir Moses Montefiore and the Rothschilds began supporting farming communities. And it was no longer just religious Jews, it was secular Jews, even atheist Jews. The Chovevei Tzion movement, which supported Jewish immigration into Eretz Israel, evolved into Zionism, a movement founded and fronted by a secular Jew, Theodor Herzl. Suddenly, thousands of Jews from across the Jewish world were moving to the land of Israel. Herzl thought that this was to escape anti-Semitism. But he was wrong. Those Jews who were escaping anti-Semitism went to America or elsewhere. Do you know how wrong Herzl was? I'll tell you. When he proposed in the early 1900s that a Jewish state be established in Uganda in East Africa so that Eastern European Jews could escape Russian anti-Semitism, his proposal was completely and utterly rejected, not by rabbis and not by Hasidic Rebbes, but by ordinary Jews, religious and secular, traditional and assimilated, for whom the thought of a Jewish country outside the land of Israel made no sense. It made no sense to them at all. And it took over 40 years longer, and so much more pain and suffering, until the country was officially Jewish. And even then, enemies of the Jews and enemies of Israel tried to undermine it at every stage. Wars, intifadas, terrorism against Jews in the diaspora, every tactic has been tried. But not only has it not worked, but Israel today has more Jews than it has ever had in its history, and more Judaism concentrated in one place than at any time since the temple in Jerusalem stood on Mount Moriah. So now that Jews in the diaspora can feel good about themselves because they have a country to escape to, should they ever need to, they feel confident to criticize it and to mouth off about it, whether it has a right to exist. My grandparents in Germany and Holland during the Holocaust period had no Israel to escape to, and they were lucky to survive with their lives. Most of their families were not so lucky. Now, had you asked them, do you agree with Israel's right to exist? If it should come into existence, of course. They would not even have understood the question. What type of question is that? Our land? Our country? A right to exist? Who even asks such a silly question? One set of my great-grandparents, my grandmother's parents, were wealthy Jews in Breslau, a city in Germany that is today called Wrocław. It's in Poland. They sold everything that they had after my great-grandfather was released from concentration camp just before the Second World War. And they used the money to buy Palestine immigration certificates, arriving in Palestine in total and abject poverty. Let me tell you this. If you would have asked my great-grandparents about Israel's right to exist, they would have thought you were crazy. For them, the land of Israel was the land of their salvation, the land of their destiny, and the land that was bound up with Jewish history. Even though they could both trace their families back in Germany for many, many centuries. Now, what impact has the story of the modern state of Israel had on me? That was the question. I'll tell you. It has meant that I can be confident as a Jew in Beverly Hills, California, and in New York, and in London, and in Perth, Australia, if I ever get there. In fact, in any place that there are Jews, they are respected and held in esteem, even if it is occasionally negative esteem, only because of the state of Israel. Make no mistake about it. I've seen all the criticism of Israel, and I consider it to be a compliment. It is a stamp of legitimacy. It's an acknowledgement that the Jews and their land are inextricably bound together with an unbreakable bond. The second question that Rabbi Sacks asked us to consider was this: why is it so important for a faith nation to have a land? I will let Rabbi Sacks explain in his own words. It was Jewish destiny, said Rabbi Sacks, to create a society that would honor the proposition that we are all created in the image and likeness of God. For that, you need a base, you need a center, you need a platform. And that platform, said God to the patriarchs, would be our land, the land of Israel. That land, when we had it, would be a place in which the freedom of some would not lead to the enslavement of others. That land, when we had it, would be the opposite of Egypt, whose bread of affliction and bitter herbs of slavery they were to eat, we Jews eat, every year on the festival of Pesach, to remind us of what we are to avoid. We tend to forget this, said Rabbi Sacks, because Jews lived in dispersion for 2,000 years without the sovereign power to govern themselves, and because modern Israel is a secular state. But Judaism is a religion of redemption rather than one of salvation. It is about the shared spaces of our collective lives, not an interior drama of the soul. And it is exactly because Judaism is also the code of a society. It is also about the social virtues, righteousness, tzedek, tzedakah, justice, mishpat, loving kindness, chesed, and compassion, rachamim. These ideals structure the template of biblical law, which covers all aspects of the life of society, its economy, its welfare systems, its education, family life, employer-employee relations, the protection of the environment, and much more. The broad principles driving this elaborate structure, traditionally enumerated as Tariag Mitzvot, 613 commandments, are clear. No one should be left in dire poverty. No one should lack access to justice and the courts. No family should be without its share of the land. 1 day in 7, everyone should be free. 1 year in 7, All debts should be cancelled. 1 year in 50, all land that had been sold was to revert to its original owners. It was the nearest thing the ancient world had ever seen to an egalitarian society. The point is, said Rabbi Sacks, none of this was possible without a land. Judaism is the constitution of a self-governing nation, the architectonics of a society dedicated to the service of God in freedom and in dignity. Without a land and without a state, Judaism is a shadow of itself. In exile, God might still live in the hearts of Jews, but not in the public square, not in the justice of the courts, not in the morality of the economy, and not in the humanitarianism of everyday life. Jews have lived in almost every country under the sun. But in a history of 4,000 years, only in Israel have they ever been a free, self-governing people. Only in the land of Israel have they been and are they able, if they so choose, to construct an agricultural framework, a medical system, and an economic infrastructure that is in the spirit of the Torah and its concern for freedom, justice, and the sanctity of life. Only in the land of Israel can Jews speak the Hebrew of the Bible as the language of everyday speech, as they do today. Another miracle, the rebirth of an ancient language as a modern vernacular. The only such phenomenon ever to happen in human history. Only in the land of Israel can Jews live in Jewish time, within a calendar that is structured according to the rhythms of the Jewish year. Only in the land of Israel can Jews live Judaism in anything other than an edited edition. In Israel, and only there, Jews can walk where the prophets walked, climb the mountains Abraham climbed, lift their eyes to the mountains that David saw, and continue the story that their ancestors began. Let me finish by trying to answer the third question, having heard Rabbi Sacks' inspiring words. The question he asked is this: what role does Israel play in your day-to-day life? My friends, not one day of my life goes past when I do not think about Israel, which I consider, along with the Torah, to be the mainframe, the hard drive of the Jewish people. But more than think about Israel, each and every day I do something for Israel. Whether it is to put some money in an Israel-related pushka, whether it is to call others to enlist their support for Israel, whether it is to familiarize myself with events that are going on in Israel, whether it is lobbying lawmakers and opinion formers to see things from Israel's perspective, each and every day presents a new opportunity. If the words of Rabbi Sacks that we have heard tonight have any meaning for you, and they should, please, in his memory, resolve to bring Israel into your day-to-day life in a more meaningful way. For those of us who live in the United States or Europe or elsewhere, there are countless opportunities. Take them up. Dive in. It is your history. It is your destiny. And it is your redemption. And even those of you who are watching this, who live in Israel, don't think that your obligation ends with your residence. Please remember, you, each one of you, are our presence in the land of Israel. You are our ambassadors. You are us, of course, until we all get there, which we will sooner rather than later. Let me end with two powerful quotes from Rabbi Sacks about Israel. Here is the first one. It is very, very beautiful. Listen carefully. Throughout our history, Israel remained the focus of Jewish hopes. Wherever Jews were, they built synagogues, each of which was a symbolic fragment of the temple in Jerusalem. Wherever Jews were, they prayed about Jerusalem, facing Jerusalem. Wherever Jews were, they remembered Jerusalem and wept for it, as the psalm had said, at every time of joy. Wherever Jews were, they never relinquished their claim to the land. And there were places in the land of Israel from which they never left. The Jewish people was the circumference of a circle at whose center was the Holy Land and Jerusalem, the holy city. That's the first quote. And if you think that's wonderful, here is the second quote. It's even better. The day will come, said Rabbi Sacks, when the story of Israel in modern times will speak not just to Jews, but to all who believe in the power of the human spirit as it reaches out to God, as an everlasting symbol of the victory of life over death, of hope over despair. Through his beautifully crafted words, Rabbi Sacks conveyed the prophecy of hope in the midst of crisis to a modern generation and for the future. May his memory be a blessing, and may we all merit to see him again at Tchias HaMesim. And may that be bimhera biyamenu, speedily in our days. Amen va'amen.